The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed, tearing through the Montana Gap like a wounded animal. Sadie Miller had 3 bullets left in her rifle, a half-empty jar of cornmeal, and 2 children shivering under a threadbare quilt. She thought the thud against the barn door was the storm finally claiming their roof. She was wrong. It was a man. He was soaked in blood, carrying a saddlebag heavier than gold, and harboring a secret that would either save them from starvation or get them all killed before sunrise. This isn't just a story about love. It is a story about the brutal price of survival. The winter of 1,887 inches, the Wyoming Territory was not merely a season. It was a sentence. For Sadie Ann Miller, a woman of 31 whose hands were calloused from gripping a plow handle and whose eyes held the gray dullness of grief, the sentence was almost up. The cabin, a rough-hewn structure of pine and mud sitting precariously on the edge of the Bitterroot foothills, groaned under the assault of the blizzard. Inside, the air was thin and freezing. The fire in the hearth was dying, much like the hope Sadie tried to hide from her children, 10-year-old Toby and 6-year-old Bess. "Mama, the wind is shaking the door," Bess whispered, clutching a rag doll that had lost its yarn hair 2 winters ago. "Hush now," Sadie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "It's just the timber settling. Go to sleep." But Sadie knew timber didn't Timber didn't gasp. She stood up, taking the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Her husband, John, had been dead for 8 months, buried under the very soil that refused to yield crops. Since then, Sadie had become the man of the house, the protector, and the silent sufferer. She moved to the door, listening. Thump. It was a heavy, wet sound, like a sack of grain dropped from a height. Sadie unlatched the heavy oak bar. If it was a wolf, she would fight. If it was a man, she might have to fight harder. She pulled the door open a crack. The wind slammed against her, blinding her with snow. But she saw it, a shape. A massive black stallion stood trembling in the drifts, its reins trailing in the snow. Beside the horse, collapsed on the icy stoop, was a heap of shearling and denim. "Toby," Sadie shouted over the gale. "Get the lantern." The boy scrambled from the bed, fear replaced by the instinct to obey. He brought the flickering light to the doorway. The man was face down. He was big, broad-shouldered, wearing a duster coat that had once been expensive, but was now shredded and stained dark. Sadie grabbed the man's shoulder and rolled him over. Toby gasped. "Is he dead, Mama?" "I don't know," Sadie grunted. "Grab his feet. We have to drag him in before the frost takes him." It was a struggle that nearly broke them. The stranger was dead weight, heavy with muscle and soaked clothing. Sadie pulled by the shoulders, her boots slipping on the floorboards, while Toby heaved at the boots. They managed to slide him near the hearth. Sadie kicked the door shut and barred it, leaning against the wood to catch her breath. The silence of the room returned, broken only by the man's ragged, shallow breathing. She knelt beside him. He was handsome in a jagged, dangerous way. Dark stubble covered a square jaw, and his hair was matted with sweat despite the cold. But it was the wound that drew her eye. Just below his ribs, the fabric of his shirt was fused to his skin with dried blood. "Is he a bandit?" Toby asked, eyeing the gun belt strapped low on the man's hips. The handle of the revolver was ivory, carved with intricate, distinct initials. C.R. "He's a human being, Toby," Sadie said, though her heart hammered a warning rhythm against her ribs. She reached for the knife she kept on the mantel. "Get the whiskey and the sewing kit, and boil water. Now." She cut away the shirt. It wasn't a claw mark or a fall. It was a bullet hole. Clean entry. No exit. He had been shot in the back. As she worked, peeling the fabric from the wound, the man's hand suddenly shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that made her gasp. His eyes flew open, steel blue and delirious. "The ledger," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "Don't. Let them take the ledger." "There's no one here but us," Sadie said firmly. prying his fingers off. "You're bleeding out, mister. Lie still or you'll die right here on my floor." He stared at her for a second, trying to focus, before his eyes rolled back and he slumped into unconsciousness. Sadie looked at the saddlebags the man had dragged with him, now sitting in a puddle of melting snow near the door. Whatever was in there, someone had tried to kill him for it, and now, that danger was under her roof. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, trapping them in a white prison. Inside, the battle was just as fierce. The stranger burned with fever. He thrashed on the pallet Sadie had made for him, muttering names and numbers that made no sense. Sadie barely slept. She rationed the last of their dried beef to the children, taking only hot water for herself. She cleaned the stranger's wound with the last of the whiskey and packed it with a poultice made from pine resin and moldy bread, an old remedy her grandmother had taught her. On the second night, the fever broke, but the man didn't wake. Sadie sat by the fire, mending Toby's trousers. She looked at the stranger's face. He looked different now that the pain lines had smoothed out. He looked younger, perhaps 35. She had searched his saddlebags. She had to know. She hadn't found gold or money. She had found papers, deeds, surveys, and a heavy, leather-bound book, the ledger he had mentioned. She couldn't read the dense legal jargon well, but she recognized the seal on the documents. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the most powerful men in the territory, men who crushed small homesteaders like bugs. Why was a man with holes in his boots carrying papers belonging to the cattle barons? "Mama," Bess whispered from the bed, "is the man going to eat our food?" The question broke Sadie's heart. "No, baby, he won't. He's big," Bess observed. "He looks like Papa did." "He's nothing like Papa," Sadie said sharply, then softened. "Go to sleep." The next morning, the storm broke. The sun glared off the white expanse, blinding and brilliant. Sadie was chopping wood outside. The woodpile was dangerously low when she heard a crash from inside the cabin. She dropped the axe and ran in. The stranger was up. He had tried to stand but had collapsed against the table, knocking over a tin cup. He was panting, his face pale as milk, holding his side. "You're going to tear those stitches," Sadie said, closing the door to keep the heat in. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time. He took in the room. The peeling mud chinking, the empty larder, the children staring at him with wide, hungry eyes. "Where is my horse?" he demanded. His voice was deep, commanding, used to being obeyed. "In the barn. He's fed." "Better than we are," Sadie retorted, moving to help him. He flinched away from her touch. "I don't need help," he growled. "You couldn't walk 10 feet in this snow," Sadie said, crossing her arms. "I dug a bullet out of your back 3 nights ago. I suggest you sit down before you fall down." He hesitated, then slowly lowered himself onto the bench. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, he saw the fatigue in her eyes, the thinness of her face. "Who are you?" he asked. "Sadie Miller. This is my home. You're welcome for the rescue, by the way." He touched the bandage on his side. "I didn't ask to be saved. Well, the ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, so you didn't have much choice," she quipped. It was a defense mechanism. Sarcasm was the only armor she had left. "What do I call you? Or should I just call you the corpse?" He paused. His eyes flicked to the saddlebags in the corner. "Clay," he lied. She could tell it was a lie. He hesitated a fraction of a second too long. "Clay. Ryland. Well, Mr. Ryland, you've eaten through my medical supplies. I don't have food to spare. As soon as you can ride, you move on. I have money," he said, reaching for his belt, then realizing his pockets were empty. He frowned. "I had money. You had $3 and a pocket watch," Sadie said. "They're on the mantel. That won't buy much out here." Clay looked at the children. He saw Toby eyeing the gun belt hanging on the chair. "Boy," Clay said. Toby jumped. "Yes, sir? You clean that gun?" "No, sir. Mama said don't touch it." Clay looked at Sadie. A strange expression crossed his face, something like respect Or perhaps regret. Your mama is a smart woman. Why were you shot, Mr. Ryland? Sadie asked, stepping closer. And don't tell me it was a hunting accident. That was a rifle round from a distance. Clay's expression hardened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold mask. I stole a horse. Wrong place. Wrong time. You stole a thoroughbred stallion? Sadie raised an eyebrow. That horse is worth more than this entire farm. You don't look like a horse thief, and you don't look like a widow starving to death. But appearances can be deceiving, he shot back. The cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Sadie's face flushed. She turned away to the stove, her hands shaking as she picked up the kettle. I'm sorry, he said quietly. The softness of his voice surprised her. That was uncalled for. We manage, she said stiffly. You're out of wood, he noted. And I smell that stew. It's mostly water. It's enough. It's not. He tried to stand again. I can chop. Sit down, Sadie barked. You tear those stitches. I am not sewing you up again. The tension was interrupted by the sound of hooves crunching on the snow outside. Not one horse. 3. Sadie froze. Clay's hand instantly went to his hip, grasping for a gun that wasn't there. Who is that? Clay hissed. Trouble, Sadie whispered. She grabbed her rifle from the wall. Get in the back room. With the kids. Now. Mrs. Miller. A voice boomed from outside. It was a slimy, cheerful voice. Oh, Mrs. Miller. Wonderful morning for a visit. Do as I say, Sadie ordered Clay. Clay Ryland, or whatever his name was, didn't move to the back room. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. 3 men, Clay narrated calmly. Dusters. Winchesters. One of them is riding a gray mare with a limping gait. That's Silas Vane, Sadie said, her face draining of color. He works for the bank. Or rather, he works for the man who owns the bank. Foreclosure? Worse. They want the water rights to the creek. They've been trying to scare me off for months. Clay looked at Sadie. He saw the fear she tried to hide from her children. He looked at the gun in her hand, an old single-shot rifle against 3 repeaters. Give me my gun, he said. You're in no condition. Give me the gun. Sadie hesitated only a second. The look in Clay's eyes wasn't madness anymore. It was cold calculation. She grabbed the gun belt from the chair and tossed it to him. He didn't strap it on. He just pulled the ivory-handled Colt .45 and checked the cylinder. 5 rounds. He kept the chamber under the hammer empty. A professional. Stay out of sight, Sadie warned. If they see a strange man here, they'll shoot first and ask questions later. They'll say I was harboring a criminal. Go, Clay said, leaning back into the shadows of the corner. Out of the line of sight from the door, but with a clear view of the entrance. Sadie opened the door. The cold air rushed in. Silas Vane sat atop his horse, flanked by 2 men who looked less like bankers and more like hired thugs. Vane was a thin man with a mustache that looked like it had been drawn on with charcoal. Mrs. Miller. Vane smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. We were worried about you with the storm and all. Just checking to see if you and the little ones had. We're fine, Silas, Sadie said, gripping her rifle. State your business and get off my land. Your land? Vane chuckled. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. Well, that's a matter of debate, isn't it? See, Mr. Paddock, God bless his generous soul, has reviewed the deed. It seems there's a discrepancy in the survey line. The creek? It actually falls on the Paddock side of the boundary. That's a lie, Sadie spat. My John surveyed this land himself. The marker is the old oak. The oak that accidentally burned down last week? Vane smirked. Sadie's knuckles turned white. They had burned the tree. They were erasing her existence, one boundary marker at a time. Get out, she whispered. Now, Sadie. Vane stepped onto the porch. Be reasonable. Mr. Paddock is willing to offer you $50 for the deed. Enough to take the kids back east. Maybe find a husband who can actually provide for you. One of the hired guns snickered. Vane reached out to touch Sadie's arm. You're a pretty woman, Sadie. It's a shame to see you waste away out here. Maybe if you were a little nicer to me, I could get Paddock to up the price to 60. Sadie jacked the lever of her rifle, pointing it at Vane's chest. Touch me, and you won't walk home. Vane's smile vanished. You stupid B-times, ch. He signaled to the men behind him. Grab her, toss the kids in the snow, burn the shack. The two men dismounted, drawing their pistols. Blam! The sound was deafening in the crisp air. It didn't come from Sadie's rifle. The hat flew off the head of the gunman on the left. A neat hole punched through the crown. He froze, eyes wide. Clay Ryland stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, the smoking Colt in his hand. He looked like death warmed over, pale, sweaty, bandages visible under his open shirt, but the gun was steady as a rock. I think the lady asked you to leave, Clay said. His voice was low, but it carried a terrifying weight. Vane stumbled back. Who the hell are you? I'm the man who's going to put the next one between your eyes if you don't get on your horses in the next 3 seconds, Clay drawled. Get him, Vane screamed at his men. He's hurt. He can't shoot. The second gunman raised his pistol. Blam, blam. 2 shots in rapid succession. The gunman's pistol spun out of his hand, shattered. The second shot kicked up snow inches from Vane's boot. I don't need to be healthy to kill you, boy, Clay said. I just need to be angry. And you're making me very angry. The gunmen scrambled for their horses. They had expected a helpless widow. They had found a gunfighter. Vane looked at Clay, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place the face. You. I know you, Vane stammered. I saw the wanted poster in Cheyenne. Then you know I don't miss, Clay bluffed. Vane scrambled into his saddle. This isn't over, Miller. You're harboring a killer. Paddock will bring the marshal. They turned and galloped away, kicking up plumes of snow. Clay watched them go until they disappeared over the ridge. Then, the adrenaline failed him. His knees buckled. Sadie caught him before he hit the floor, dropping her rifle to support his weight. She dragged him back to the bench. His side was bleeding again. Fresh red stained the white bandage. You idiot, Sadie hissed, but her voice was shaking. You could have gotten us all killed. I just saved your roof, Clay wheezed, closing his eyes. And they were right. About the wanted poster. Sadie paused, her hands covered in his blood. What did you do? Clay looked at her, his vision blurring. I didn't steal a horse, Sadie. I stole a legacy. My name isn't Clay Ryland. Then who are you? My name, he whispered, fighting the darkness, is Charles Bannister. Sadie gasped. The Bannister family owned half of Montana. They were royalty, and they were ruthless. Charles Bannister is dead, Sadie said. I read it in the papers. He died in a fire in Chicago 3 months ago. Evidently not. He managed a weak grin. But my brother, he sure wishes I was. The silence that followed the departure of Silas Vane and his men was heavier than the storm. It was a silence filled with the echo of gunshots and the unspoken promise of violence to come. Sadie didn't ask questions immediately. She moved with the efficiency of a woman used to disaster. She rebarred the door, adding a heavy oak table against it. She checked the window shutters, nailing a loose board tight. Charles, she couldn't quite bring herself to think of him as Clay anymore, sat on the bench, his face gray with pain. The adrenaline dump had left him shaking. You need to lie down, Sadie said, her voice devoid of the earlier sharp edge. It was softer now, tinged with a reluctant gratitude. If I lie down, I might not get up, Charles gritted out. Vane won't stop. Paddock, whoever he is, wants this land. Now that they know I'm here, they'll bring enough men to burn us out. Paddock owns the bank in town, Sadie explained, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound tighter. He's been buying up the valley for 2 years. He squeezed the Johnsons out last winter. They froze to death in a wagon on the way to Oregon, Charles hissed as she tightened the bandage. He sounds like my brother. Your brother. Morgan? Sadie guessed, recalling the newspaper stories about the Bannister Empire. Morgan, Charles confirmed. The name tasting like bile. He's the one who put the bullet in me. Or rather, he paid a man to do it. Sadie finished the knot and sat back on her heels. Why come here? Why this cabin? You were miles off the main road. I wasn't aiming for your cabin, Charles admitted. I was aiming for the pass. I thought I could make it to the marshal in Laramie. My horse, Titan, he smelled your smoke. He brought me here. He saved my life before you did. Titan. A small voice piped up. They both turned. Bess was peeking out from the bedroom curtain, her eyes wide. Is the horse's name Titan? She asked. Charles's face, usually a mask of stoic pain, softened incrementally. Yes, little one. He's a brute, but he's got a heart of gold. Can I see him? Not now, Bess, Sadie said quickly. It's not safe. Come here, Charles said to the girl. He didn't order. He invited. Bess hesitated, then crept closer. Toby followed. Protective, but curious. Charles reached into his pocket, the one on his vest, not the empty pants pockets. He pulled out a small, shiny object. It was a silver coin, but not currency. It was a medallion, engraved with a galloping horse. This, Charles said, holding it out to Bess, is for luck. Titan wears one on his bridle. I carry this one. It's kept me alive through 3 wars and a brother who wants me dead. Maybe it'll keep you safe, too. Bess took the coin, her small fingers brushing his rough, scarred hand. Thank you, Mr. Charles. Just Charles, he corrected. Sadie watched the exchange, her heart aching. John used to do things like that, small magic tricks, little gifts from the town. Seeing a strange man, a dangerous man, show kindness to her children confused her defenses. Toby, Charles said, shifting his gaze to the boy. You ever shoot a repeater? Only a single shot, Toby said, puffing out his chest. I'm a good shot. I hit a rabbit at 50 yards. Rabbits don't shoot back, Charles said grimly. But good aim is a start. Bring me that Winchester. Charles, he's 10, Sadie protested. And if they come through that door tonight, Sadie, he's going to need to be a man, Charles said. His eyes locked with hers. There was no cruelty in them, only a desperate pragmatism. I can't cover every window. If I go down, he's the last line. Sadie swallowed the lump in her throat. She nodded once. For the next hour, the cabin became a classroom of war. Charles showed Toby how to load the Winchester, how to work the lever smoothly without jamming it, and most importantly, how to wait. Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, Charles instructed, his voice low and steady. A missed shot tells them where you are. A hit stops them cold. As evening drew in, the wind picked up again. The snow had stopped, but the cold was bitter. Sadie made a meager dinner, cornbread made with water instead of milk, and the last of the salted pork. They ate in silence, the tension vibrating in the air. Every creak of the roof beams sounded like a footstep. Every howl of the wind sounded like a shout. You should sleep, Charles said to Sadie. He was sitting in a chair by the door, the Colt resting on his thigh. I can't, she said. She was cleaning her rifle for the 3rd time. You have to. If they come, it'll be at dawn. That's when the courage is highest and the guards are sleepiest. I'll take the first watch. You're the one with the hole in his side, Sadie argued. I've had worse, he lied. Go. Be with your kids. Sadie looked at him. In the flickering firelight, the hard angles of his face were shadowed. He looked lonely, incredibly, profoundly lonely. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, he replied, looking at the door. We're not out of this. Sadie went to the back room and lay down with Bess and Toby. They were already asleep, clutching the silver coin between them. Sadie listened to the rhythm of their breathing, and beyond that, the steady, rhythmic click-clack of Charles spinning the cylinder of his revolver. It was a sound of violence, but tonight, it was the most comforting sound she had ever heard. The attack didn't come at dawn. The morning passed in a white, blinding glare of sun on snow. It was a psychological game now. Vane knew they were trapped. He was letting them sweat. He was letting the cold and the hunger do the work for him. By noon, The temperature had dropped again. The fire was low. Sadie counted 3 logs left. Charles was worse. The exertion of the previous day had taken a toll. His skin was hot to the touch, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the freezing room. Sadie insisted he lie down on the pallet. He resisted, but his legs gave out, ending the argument. She sat beside him, changing the dressing. The wound was angry, red, and inflamed. "I need to cauterize it," she said softly. "The infection is spreading." Charles nodded, his jaw tight. "Do it." She heated her knife in the coals until it glowed dull red. She handed him a piece of leather strap. "Bite on this." The smell of searing flesh filled the small cabin. Charles didn't scream. He arched his back, a guttural groan escaping his throat, his hands gripping the edges of the pallet so hard his knuckles cracked. Then he went limp, gasping for air. Sadie wiped his forehead with a cool rag. Her own hands were shaking. "It's done. It's done." He looked up at her, his blue eyes glassy with pain and fever. "Why do you stay?" he rasped. "You could have taken the kids, walked to town, told them I forced you, and leave you here to die?" Sadie asked. "I'm a stranger, a trouble magnet. You're a human being." She repeated her words from the first night. "And you stood up for us." "No one has stood up for us since John died." "John," Charles murmured. "Tell me about him." Sadie sat back, looking into the dying fire. He was a dreamer. He thought this valley could be a paradise. He worked himself into the ground. It wasn't the land that killed him, really. It was the worry. The debt. Paddock squeezed him on the loan interest until John was working 20 hours a day just to pay the vig. His heart just stopped. One day in the field, she wiped a tear from her cheek, angry at her own weakness. "I promised him I wouldn't lose the land. It's all we have for the kids." Charles reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but warm. "You won't lose it. You can't promise that." "I can," Charles said. He took a deep breath, gathering his strength for the truth. "The papers in my saddlebag." "The ledger. I saw it," Sadie admitted. "That ledger details every illegal transaction my brother Morgan has made in the last 5 years. He's been using the family rail company to drive down land prices, bankrupting farmers like John, buying the land for pennies through shell companies, and then routing the railroad right through their properties to sell for millions." Sadie stared at him. That's monstrous." "It's business," Charles said bitterly. "Or at least, that's what Morgan calls it. I found out. I confronted him. He offered me half to stay quiet. I told him I was going to the governor, and then the fire?" "The fire," Charles nodded. "He burned down my townhouse in Chicago. Thought I was inside. I was. With a lady friend." He glanced at Sadie apologetically. "When I came back and saw the ashes, I knew I was dead either way. So I ran. I broke into his office, stole the ledger, and headed west. I figured if I could get to the federal marshal in Wyoming, I could bring him down. He sent bounty hunters. Paddock. He must be one of Morgan's local partners. That's why he wants your land. The railroad is coming through here, Sadie, right through your living room." Sadie felt chill that had nothing to do with the winter. "So, my husband died for a train track?" "He died for Morgan's greed," Charles corrected. "But that ledger? It proves Paddock is colluding. It proves the foreclosure is illegal fraud. If that book gets to a judge, Paddock goes to prison. And you keep your land. Hell, you'd own the bank by the time the lawsuits are done." Sadie looked at the saddlebags in the corner. That tattered leather bag held the key to her freedom. "But first," Charles said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we have to survive tonight." "Why tonight?" "Because Vane knows I'm hurt. He knows I'm alone. And he knows if I get out of here with that book, his boss hangs. They won't wait for the law. They're coming to kill us all, Sadie." "No witnesses." Sadie stood up. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard rage. She was done being the victim. She was done being the poor widow. Then let them come, she said. She went to the wall and took down John's old double-barreled shotgun. It was heavy, a bear gun. Show me how to use this, she commanded. Charles smiled, a weak but genuine smile that reached his eyes. Yes, ma'am. For the rest of the afternoon, the cabin was a flurry of preparation. They moved the heavy wardrobe in front of the window. They filled buckets with snow to melt for water in case of fire. They created firing slits in the mud, chinking. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in hues of blood, orange and violet, they heard it. The sound of many horses, not 3 this time, maybe 10, and the sound of a wagon. They brought a wagon, Toby whispered, peering through a crack. For the loot? Bess asked. No, Charles said, dragging himself off the pallet and checking his Colt one last time. To carry the bodies. He looked at Sadie. She was pale, but her jaw was set. She looked beautiful in the dim light, a warrior mother protecting her brood. Sadie, Charles said. She turned to him. If this goes bad, if they breach the door, you give them the book. You tell them, I forced you to hide me. You beg for the kids' lives. No, Sadie said fiercely. Sadie, no. She stepped close to him, gripping his shirt. We do this together. You saved us. I'm saving you. That's the deal. Charles looked at her, and in that moment, the distance between them vanished. He saw a woman of immense strength, and he realized that for the first time in his life of privilege and war, he had something truly worth fighting for. Not money, not revenge, but this family. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting second. Together, he whispered. Together, she echoed. Outside, a voice boomed through the twilight. It wasn't vain. It was deeper, smoother. Mr. Bannister, the voice called out. We know you're in there. Come out with the book, and the woman and children live. Stay, and you all burn. Charles stepped to the firing slit. That's Paddock, he said. The man himself. He smashed the glass of the window with the butt of his gun. Come and get it, you son of a B-times, Charles roared into the night. The answer was a hail of lead that shredded the wood of the door and sent splinters flying like shrapnel. The siege had begun. The first volley of bullets turned the front of the cabin into a cloud of splinters. Sadie shoved Toby and Bess to the floor, covering them with her own body, as glass from the window shattered inward, raining down like jagged diamonds. Charles didn't flinch. He sat propped against the overturned table, counting his shots. He couldn't afford to waste a single piece of lead. Every time a shadow moved across the snow-lit yard, Charles fired. Every time he fired, a man screamed or a horse reared. Stay low, Charles roared over the din. We can't stay here, Sadie screamed back, crawling toward him. The wood is old and dry. If they throw a torch, as if on cue, a heavy thud shook the roof. Then another. The smell of kerosene wafted down through the cracks in the ceiling, pungent and terrifying. Burn them out. Paddock's voice cut through the gunfire, gleeful and maniacal. Roast the rats. A flickering orange light began to dance through the cracks in the roof boards. The heat rose instantly. Toby, Charles barked, his face pale and slick with sweat. The root cellar. The trapdoor is under the rug. Take your sister. Go. But Mama, go, Sadie ordered, her voice breaking. She grabbed the boy's face. You keep Bess safe. You don't come out until the shooting stops. Do you hear me? Toby nodded, tears streaming down his face. He grabbed Bess's hand and dragged her toward the rug. Sadie watched them disappear into the dark, damp hole beneath the floorboards, pulling the rug back over the seam. Now, it was just her and the dying cowboy. You need to go with them, Charles wheezed, reloading his Colt with trembling hands. Blood was soaking through his bandage again, pooling on the floorboards. I am not leaving you, Sadie said, racking the slide of her shotgun. Sadie, look at me, Charles said, grabbing her wrist. I'm done. I've got 1, maybe 2 good fights left in me. I'm going to kick that door open and draw their fire. You take the rifle and pick off Paddock. He's the head of the snake. Kill him, and the hired guns will scatter. No, Sadie wept. That's suicide. It's redemption. Charles smiled sadly. I spent my whole life taking up space. Let me do something that matters. Before she could stop him, he used the table to haul himself up. He looked at the burning roof, then at the door. He took a deep breath, his eyes turning to steel. For John, he whispered. Charles kicked the barricade aside. He threw the door open and stepped out onto the burning porch. The sudden appearance of the man they thought was crippled stunned the attackers. Charles stood tall, outlined by the flames behind him like an avenging demon. He raised his Colt. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots. 3 men dropped from their saddles. The return fire was instantaneous. Bullets ripped through the air. Charles jerked as a round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. But he didn't fall. He fired his last 2 rounds, dropping a man who was lighting a fresh torch. Then, the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Charles sank to his knees, his strength finally failing him. Paddock rode forward, his face twisted in a victorious sneer. He held a heavy revolver in his gloved hand. The fire from the cabin roof roared behind them, casting long, dancing shadows on the snow. Mr. Bannister, Paddock mocked, aiming his gun at Charles's head. A valiant effort. But business is business. Charles looked up, blood trickling from his mouth. You'll hang for this, Paddock. Who's going to tell? Paddock laughed. The widow? The brats? They'll be ashes in an hour. Paddock cocked the hammer. Any last words? Yeah, Charles gasped. Duck. Paddock frowned in confusion. What? From the darkness of the doorway behind Charles, a new sound emerged. Not the crack of a pistol, but the deep, thundering roar of a double-barreled shotgun. Sadie stepped through the flames, her hair wild, her eyes burning with a rage that eclipsed the fire. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the angel of death. Boom! The buckshot hit Paddock square in the chest. The force of the blast lifted him out of his saddle and threw him 10 feet back into the snow. He was dead before he hit the ground. The remaining 3 henchmen froze. They looked at their dead boss. They looked at the burning cabin. And they looked at the woman standing over the fallen cowboy, reloading her shotgun with terrifying calmness. Go! One of them screamed. She's crazy. They spurred their horses and fled into the night, leaving their dead and their courage behind. Sadie dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside Charles. The heat was unbearable now. The porch roof was sagging. Charles, she screamed, shaking him. Charles, wake up, he groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Did you get him? I got him, she sobbed. Now I've got you. She hooked her arms under his shoulders. The adrenaline gave her the strength of 10 men. She dragged him off the burning porch, through the snow, away from the heat. Toby! Bess! She screamed at the ground near the foundation. The root cellar door burst open. Toby scrambled out, coughing in the smoke, pulling Bess behind him. They huddled together near the barn, watching their home, their memories, and everything John had built, consumed by the inferno. The roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that rose up to join the stars. Sadie held Charles's head in her lap. He was unconscious again, his breathing shallow and ragged. They had won the battle. But as the cold night air settled over them, Sadie knew the war for his life was just beginning. The journey to Rock Creek was a descent into a different kind of hell. The adrenaline that had fueled Sadie during the shootout had evaporated, replaced by a bone-deep, terrifying exhaustion. The wagon, an old buckboard with a rusted axle, groaned over every rut and stone in the frozen trail. Sadie didn't hold the reins. She gripped them as if they were the only thing tethering her to the earth. Titan, the massive black stallion, seemed to understand the gravity of the cargo he pulled. He didn't fight the harness or the heavy load. He simply marched, his breath pluming in the moonlight like a steam engine, pulling his fallen master toward salvation. In the back, nestled among scratchy horse blankets and sweet-smelling hay, Charles was dangerously quiet. Every few miles, Sadie would stop the wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs, to check him. His skin was clammy, gray as ash, and the blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages, staining the straw beneath him a dark, alarming crimson. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely to the unconscious man, her hand trembling as she brushed hair from his forehead. "You didn't survive a fire and a siege just to die in a wagon bed." They reached Rock Creek as the first bruised purple light of dawn touched the horizon. The town was still sleeping, silent save for the barking of a distant dog. Sadie didn't care. She drove the wagon straight to the doctor's house, pounding on the door until her knuckles were raw. Dr. Greeley was a man of few words and much patience, smelling perpetually of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He took one look at the man in the wagon and didn't ask a single question about the bullet holes. He simply summoned his orderly, and together they carried Charles into the surgery. For 6 hours, Sadie sat in the waiting room. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Every now and then, the murmur of voices or the clink of metal on metal would drift through the door, causing Sadie to flinch. Toby and Bess slept curled together on a wooden bench, their faces streaked with soot and dried tears. But Sadie couldn't close her eyes. If she blinked, she feared the silence would become permanent. When Dr. Greeley finally emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, he looked exhausted. "He's alive," Greeley grunted, sinking into a chair opposite her. "I dug 2 slugs out of him. The one in the shoulder shattered the clavicle. But it'll heal. The one in the side missed the liver by a fraction of an inch. He's lost a lot of blood, Mrs. Miller." Sadie let out a breath she felt she had been holding for days. "Will he recover? He's got the constitution of an ox," Greeley said, eyeing her over his spectacles. "And he muttered your name about a dozen times while the ether was taking hold. A man with that much stubbornness usually pulls through. But he needs rest. Weeks of it." The days that followed were a blur of logistics and law. Sadie couldn't return to the ashes of her home, so she took a room at a modest boarding house on the edge of town. She had no money, but the town had heard the story. The widow who fought off Paddock had become an instant legend. The boarding house owner, a kindly woman named Mrs. Higgins, refused to take a dime. 2 days later, the federal marshal arrived from Cheyenne, a tall man with a walrus mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's cruelty. He sat in the private parlor of the boarding house, the leather-bound ledger open on his knees. Sadie watched him read. She watched his expression shift from skepticism to shock, and finally, to a grim fury. "This is comprehensive," the marshal said, his voice low. "Paddock wasn't just squeezing you, Mrs. Miller. He was running a shell game for the Bannister estate. Extortion, fraud, bribing county surveyors. This book documents it all." "Paddock admitted to killing my husband," Sadie said. Her voice was hollow, the grief finally finding a space to land. "He told me before he died. He drove John to his grave on purpose." The marshal closed the book with a heavy thud. "Then justice has been served, albeit roughly. Under the Homestead Act, and in light of this evidence, the bank's foreclosure on your land is illegal. The debt is void. In fact, given the damages Paddock's estate will owe you, you're likely the wealthiest woman in the county right now." Sadie looked at her hands. They were rough, scarred, and stained with soot that wouldn't scrub off. She didn't feel wealthy. She felt like a survivor of a shipwreck who had washed ashore alone. "I don't want his money," she whispered. "I just want peace." "You'll have it," the marshal promised. "I'll see to it." It was 3 weeks before Charles was well enough to leave the clinic. In that time, Sadie had visited him only once, while he was sleeping. She had seen the nurses attending to him, seen the telegrams piling up on his bedside table from Chicago and New York. He wasn't Clay Ryland the drifter anymore. He was Charles Bannister, a tycoon, a man who moved empires. The reality of the chasm between them began to set in. She was a farmer who had lost everything. He was a prince who was finally returning to his throne. On the day he was discharged, Sadie was in her room at the boarding house, packing the few meager belongings she had acquired. She planned to head back to the valley, to live in the barn until she could rebuild. A knock came at the door. When she opened it, she barely recognized him. Charles stood in the hallway. He was clean-shaven, revealing a strong, square jawline. He wore a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a stark contrast to the bloody duster he had arrived in. His arm was in a sling, but he stood tall. He looked powerful. He looked like a stranger. "Sadie?" he said. His voice was the same, that deep, gravelly timbre that vibrated in her chest, but the tone was uncertain. "Mr. Bannister," she said, her throat tight. She stepped back to let him in. "You look... well, I feel like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo, but I'm walking," he joked, weakly. The joke fell flat in the tension of the room. He looked around the small, cramped room, seeing the packed bag on the bed. "You're leaving?" "I have to get back," Sadie said, unable to meet his eyes. "The livestock needs tending. The fences act up in the thaw." "To what?" Charles asked softly. "Sadie, the cabin is gone." "I'll rebuild," she said, her chin coming up with that stubborn pride he had learned to admire. "We survived the winter. We'll survive the spring. I have to go back to Chicago," Charles said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known it was coming, but hearing it shattered the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile that felt like glass. "You have your life. Your brother to deal with. The railroad. I do," Charles said. He stepped closer, invading her space, bringing with him the scent of bay rum and rain. "Morgan is going to prison. The board of directors sent a telegram. They want me to take over as chairman. They want me to run the whole empire." "Congratulations," Sadie whispered. "It's what you deserve." "I told them to go to hell." Sadie's head snapped up. "What?" "I told them I'm retiring from the railroad business," Charles said. A mischievous glint returned to his blue eyes, the same spark she had seen when he faced down 3 gunmen with an empty pistol. "I'm thinking of getting into the cattle business. Maybe in Montana. I hear there's a valley there, near Miller's Creek, that has excellent water rights and a woman who knows how to shoot a double-barreled shotgun." Sadie stared at him, her breath catching. "Charles, you can't be serious. You're a Bannister. You belong in a mansion, not a barn." "I've lived in mansions," Charles said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "They were cold, empty places. I spent 35 years surrounded by people who only wanted my money or my name." He reached out with his good hand, capturing hers. His grip was warm, solid, real. "I spent 3 days in a shack that was burning down, and it was the first time in my life I felt like I was home. Because of you." "But I have nothing," Sadie protested, tears spilling over. "I have 2 kids, a burned-down house, and a bad temper." "You have everything I want," he countered. He went down on one knee. It wasn't the graceful motion of a courtier. It was the stiff, painful movement of a man with healing ribs. But to Sadie, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Sadie Miller. I am a man with a lot of baggage, a few bullet holes, and a very difficult family. But everything I have, my name, my fortune, and whatever life I have left is yours, if you'll have me." From the corner of the room, near the wash basin, a small giggle erupted. Bess and Toby were peeking out from behind the curtain. Bess gave a thumbs up. Sadie looked down at this man, this dying cowboy who had crashed into her door and changed the trajectory of her stars. She saw the scars, yes, but she also saw the future. "You're going to have to help me rebuild the fence," she said, her voice trembling between laughter and sobs. "And you're not allowed to cook. I'll build you a castle," he promised, his eyes shining. "A cabin will do," she laughed, pulling him up and kissing him. They didn't build a castle, but they didn't build a cabin either. The Bannister Miller Ranch became the largest operation in the territory, a sprawling expanse of green pastures and thriving herds. The railroad did eventually come through, but at Charles's insistence, the tracks curved, respectfully, around the barley fields, never disturbing the peace of the valley. The town of Miller's Creek flourished, fueled by the investments of its newest resident. A new school was built, then a library, then a proper clinic for Dr. Greeley. but the locals knew better than to treat him like an outsider. To them, he was just Charles, the man who rode a black stallion named Titan and sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday next to Sadie and the children. Every winter, on the anniversary of the blizzard, Sadie and Charles would observe a quiet tradition. When the wind howled and the snow piled high against the drifts, they would sit by the massive stone fireplace in their ranch house. They would send Toby, now a young man, running the herd, and Bess to bed. Charles would pour 2 glasses of whiskey, and Sadie would retrieve the old, charred leather ledger from the safe. They would read a page, remembering the fear, the fire, and the desperation. Then, Charles would toss the whiskey into the fire, watching it flare, and lock the book away for another year. It was a reminder: life is brutal. The wind screams, the snow falls, and wolves come to the door. But as long as you have someone to hold the line with you, you can survive the storm. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the storm brings you exactly what you need. And that is the legend of Sadie Miller and Charles Bannister. It's a reminder that sometimes our salvation doesn't come dressed in shining armor, but in a blood-soaked coat and a desperate plea for help. Sadie thought she was saving a stranger, but in the end, they saved each other. It wasn't the gold in his saddlebags that mattered, it was the steel in their spines, and the love that grew in the coldest winter of their lives. If this story touched your heart, or if you just love a good old-fashioned Western romance where the good guys win and the bad guys get what's coming to them, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, it really helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next trail.